This is the most work I've ever done for a single dish to date. From early on in my cooking days, Tonkotsu Ramen is something that I've always longed to try to make at home, but it's an astounding amount of work to try to make everything from scratch. So many different steps that take lots of hours of attentive work, not even just passive waiting. So this is something that would take you 2 to 3 days if you tried to do everything at once. But with my schedule, that's impossible to do because I never have that many days or hours back to back available just for me to use like that. So I spread this out over several months actually. I'm obviously not an expert at ramen making, but I still wanted to share what I did to make this. I don't think anyone's going to come to this video trying to learn to make ramen from scratch, but I know some of you live vicariously through me making new dishes at home, so hopefully this can be entertaining and a little bit educational as well. So to me, the most demanding part of this recipe is making the broth, and the reason is for the 12-hour rolling boil time. This is not nearly the longest part of the recipe, nor is it even the hardest in my opinion, but it's nearly impossible for me to find a 12-hour slot where I'm at home and able to be attentive to a pot. So on a day in April, I had most of the day that I could stay home and do this. The secret to this broth is using pork trotters or pig feet. Over the course of the long boil, they basically completely break down and release all of their gelatin and flavor from the bones into the stock. So I'm using 3 pounds of these, which I got at my Asian market, and just a supplement, I've seen other recipes do this, I'm using 1 pound of chicken feet. I think they provide a lot more gelatin to the stock and make it really bouncy and really thick to the mouthfeel, and they're just very cheap, also from the Asian market. I'm going to cover these with water in a large stock pot and bring them to a preliminary boil to purge them. Soon after the water boils, you'll see a lot of bubbles and scum rise to the top, and we just want to get rid of all that. So I let that boil on high for like 10 minutes just to really release all that nasty stuff. You could try to skim this and reserve the water below to make the stock, but I just dumped the entire thing and strained the bones out. I just want to make sure all that gross stuff is gone. I'm even going to rinse the bones off just to make sure it's really nice and clean. At this point, I'm going to add the aromatics that I was chopping up during the initial boil. That consists of about 10 scallions, 1 yellow onion, 3 carrots or about a pound, 1 whole ginger root, 8 ounces or 225 grams of fresh mushrooms. I'm using white, and then I'm also using 2 handfuls of dried mushrooms. I have some shiitake and porcini, 1 whole head of garlic, and 2 leeks. It's a lot of stuff, but we want our tonkotsu broth to be full of flavor. I'm just making sure to wash the leeks out as they're always dirty, but pretty much everything else you can just rough chop. You don't have to peel it or cut the roots off or anything. I'm also cutting the ginger and the garlic lengthwise down the middle just to expose the meat inside. But none of this has to be pretty because all this is going to flavor our stock and then be tossed out. So now this gets thrown into the pot with the clean chicken and pig's feet, followed by a clean gallon or 16 cups of water. And now all we do is bring this to a high rolling boil and leave it there for 12 hours. It's a long time, but it's the right amount to extract the proper amount of flavor and gelatin from the bones. You don't have to do much, just come by and maybe stir it every so often and just make sure your house isn't burning down. If you really do have to leave for a little bit, which I did at some point during the day, I just tossed this into my oven at about a 250-degree setting. I just feel safer with that than with an open flame on my stove. But either way, after the 10 hours is over, you're done. You can just strain out all the solids, which solids is putting it nicely. All those bones have basically disintegrated into nothing at this point. I'm dividing this into 4 quart containers, but in hindsight, I would have divided it into more because I was going to freeze this for a couple months before I was going to make the ramen, and these liquids expand in the freezer. Just keep that in mind if you're freezing it. But you'll see that after these cool down, they become almost a solid stock. Again, that's all the gelatin at work. It's going to make for that really thick and nice mouthfeel that you associate with tonkotsu ramen. Now to make this broth taste like it should, we need to make some tare, which is the seasoning mixture. You just add spoonfuls of this to each bowl to flavor it as much as needed. Starting by making a simple dashi stock using a couple pieces of kombu, which is just dried kelp. I'm first going to rinse it off because sometimes it has dust and dirt on the outside. Then I'll stick it in a pot with 4 cups of water. I'm also throwing in 2 dried shiitake mushrooms because I like the flavor of them. I'm soaking that for about 15 minutes before putting it over medium heat. I just need to bring that to a bare simmer. I don't need to boil this. And when I start to see bubbles, I'm going to pull out the mushrooms and the kombu, which I'll then kill the heat and add in some bonito flakes. These are fish flakes that are going to bring a bunch of umami to your tare. I'm using about a cup of those, which is about 4 packs of this pack that I bought at my Asian market. You just need to steep those for about 10 minutes. You don't want to boil or simmer them, so that's why we killed the heat. Then I'll strain this over a coffee filter and sieve into a bowl, and that's my dashi stock. Then I'll make a flavoring mixture with the following: 1/2 cup of soy sauce, 1/2 cup of dark soy sauce, 1/4 cup of mirin, and 1/4 cup of sake. I'm then going to add the dashi as well as this mixture into a pot over medium, adding in a couple of tablespoons of brown sugar, 2 cloves of grated garlic, and a 1-inch knob of grated ginger. Finishing up with a teaspoon of sesame oil and some freshly ground black pepper. I'm going to stir that and bring it to a boil and then lower to a simmer and leave it there for 10 minutes. Finally, I'll strain one more time into a bowl, and that's your tare. Something I did not do that I should have is added some salt to this mixture. As you're gonna see, I ended up needing to use a lot of tare in my bowl, which darkens it up and kind of makes it less appealing than that pale color you want from your tonkotsu broth. So I'm gonna estimate below the amount of salt you should add at the end of this to make it more viable. Next up is maybe my favorite part of the bowl, which is the chashu pork. It's just a marinated and braised, slow-cooked pork belly. The fat renders out beautifully, and it's a perfect accompaniment to a bowl of ramen. So I've got a slab of skinless pork belly that's about 4 to 5 pounds, so I'm going to cut that in half to make it 2 to 2.5 pounds. And this part is harder than it looks. We have to roll this up to get that iconic spiral shape. Make sure the fat side is on the inside and just try to go as tightly as possible. You're going to need some butcher's twine to keep this closed. I just tried to roll that pork belly really tight and get that twine around it and tie it as tight as possible. There's a more skillful way to do this with just one cut of twine, but I don't know how to do that. So I just went 6 or 7 increments of twine just to keep the whole thing closed. Then I'm going to try to add this to a long vacuum sealed bag before realizing it's not wide enough to fit around the pork roll. So I'll try to cut the sides a little bit to make it more wide, and then I'll just have to cut that slit off at the top. And that worked. I got it around the pork and could shimmy it down all the way to the bottom. I'm doing this sous vide, by the way. You could do this in a Dutch oven and just braise it, but this is easier for me. So I'm going to add my marinade / braising mixture, which is going to be 3 green onions, 5 cloves of garlic, or 2 of these
massive boys,
and a 3-inch knob of peeled ginger. I'm roughly going to chop all this. It doesn't need to be perfect because it's going to get strained out later. To that, I'm going to add a half cup of soy sauce, a half cup of mirin, and a half cup of sake, and finally a 1/4 cup of brown sugar. Since I'm doing this sous vide, there's a risk of botulism from the raw garlic, so what I'm going to do is quickly add this to a small sauce pot and bring it to an instantaneous boil. That's going to kill any of the bacteria possibilities from the raw garlic. Then I'll just let that slightly cool while I roll out my pork belly, and then I'll add it into my vacuum bag. Now comes the hard part, because sealing liquid-filled bags is pretty hard with a vacuum sealer. It's okay because I found a hack online. You just put your vacuum sealer on the edge of a countertop and then kind of hang the bag off the side. Position it in the vacuum sealer and start to vacuum seal, and keep a close eye on it because as soon as you see the liquid start getting to the top of it, you're going to press the seal button. That should seal your bag without sucking up a lot of liquid into your vacuum sealer and destroying it. And let's see. Looks like it was a failure. I don't know if I pressed the seal button too late or too early, but I'm going to try this again. Squeeze that into another vacuum sealed bag and try again. And yep, that's another failure. If someone wants to let me know what I was doing wrong in the comments, please do, because I wasted a lot of vacuum sealed bags. Either way, I'm just dumping this into a Ziploc bag because I know that's going to be sealed. And the trick here is to use the water displacement method, so you stick this into the water bath, and as you press the bag into the water, all the air is going to rise to the top and kind of vacuum seal it itself. It's not going to be perfect, but it'll be good enough for our purposes. Problem is, I was heating up this water while I was rolling up the pork, and it was already 145 degrees Fahrenheit. Kind of burned my hands a little bit trying to get this in there, but we finally got there. Yeah, speaking of, I set my sous vide to 145 Fahrenheit, and I'm going to do this for 24 hours. I've seen people do it for 155 for less time, but I want the fat to have more time to render out. I place a wet stone on top to make sure the bag is fully submerged, and then I put some foil around the top to make sure it doesn't evaporate. And this goes just like this for 24 hours undisturbed. Well, I did disturb it a couple times to make sure the water was full, and also to roll the pork around to make sure it was submerged in the liquid. But after that 24 hours is up, you're going to have a super tender and flavorful and juicy pork belly. Best practice is to strain off the cooking liquid, which we're going to save for later, so don't throw it out, and then to stick this in the fridge at least a few hours or overnight. That's going to allow this to set up and for the fat to solidify again, so that when you're slicing this, it doesn't just run out all over the place. So yeah, you're going to need multiple days, weeks, months, whatever to make this dish if you're doing it from scratch. I know we've went through a lot so far, but we haven't even got to the hardest part, which is making the ramen noodles from scratch. You could totally buy these at the store and they'd be fine, but I wanted to do this at least once for the challenge. So I'm going to try to go through this quick. I'm going to start with 1 tablespoon or 15 grams of baking soda. We're going to bake it, which is going to do sciencey things to it and raise its alkalinity, which is what we want for a chewier noodle. I'm throwing that into my oven at 250 Fahrenheit for 1 hour. And then I'll take it out and add it to 320 mils of water, also adding 10 grams or a tablespoon and a half of kosher salt. Mix that together, and that's going to be our alkaline mixture. That's what separates these noodles from like Italian pasta dough. I'm doing this in my stand mixer, but a food processor works as well. I'm adding 800 grams of bread flour and then 10 grams of vital wheat gluten. The vital wheat gluten just bumps up the protein content of this dough and makes it even chewier. So I'll mix that by hand with the dough hook for a second just to make sure it's combined. And then while it's running, I'll slowly stream in that water mixture in 3 parts, letting each part incorporate by itself first. And after a few minutes, you should have a sort of cohesive dough ball. It'll be a little sandy and pebbly, but that's what you want. I'm going to try and press that together a little bit and then cover it with a damp towel and let it hydrate at room temperature for like 30 minutes. You could go straight to the next step, but I'm going to put this into a bag and seal it and let it rest overnight in the fridge. That's said to enhance the flavor and texture even more. By the way, you can see how the baking soda really affects the color of this dough. Kinda cool. Now this is going to be one of the toughest doughs you've ever worked with because it has a really low hydration and also the alkalinity affects it, so you're going to need a lot of time to do this. I'm first separating this dough ball into 4 portions to make it easier to work with. Always keep the unused dough resting in a sealed bag so it doesn't dry out. But with each portion I'm going to try to press this out and flatten it out as much as possible. I'm going to be passing this through my pasta roller, so it needs to be pretty thin. By the way, I'm using my stand mixer attachment pasta roller and pasta cutter for this. I'll link something similar below, but you can also use the hand roller for something like this. Anyway, when it's just about thin enough so I can start passing it through my roller, I'm going to get that set up. Obviously go to the widest setting and then set my stand mixer speed to 2. Once I'm able to pass the dough through, I'm going to fold it in thirds like a letter and then flatten it out again by hand. This is going to help laminate it and distribute the hydration evenly throughout the dough, which is going to make it less rough and craggly. After doing that fold method twice, I'm going to start lowering the thickness setting on my roller. Mine has 8 settings, by the way. I start at 8, which is the widest, and then go 1 down at a time. As long as you're keeping everything straight, this should be fine to keep pushing through lower and lower until you get to setting number 3. This is where I like to put it, but if you want thicker noodles, you can stop at 4, and if you want thinner, you can go to 2. At this point, it's about 1.5 to 2 feet long, so I'm going to grab my bench scraper and separate this into 3 sections. That's about how long your ramen noodles are going to be. Then I'll hook up my spaghetti cutter attachment and then raise the speed to 4 on the stand mixer. Carefully pass through each sheet of dough and you should have these beautiful strands of ramen. I quickly dust each with some cornstarch and distribute that throughout so they don't stick. Leave those on a parchment lined baking sheet and repeat with the rest of the pasta sheets. And once all is said and done and you've repeated everything with the other 3 sections of dough, I had about 11 servings of ramen, which I separated them into about 100 gram servings. This whole recipe for everything is supposed to be for 8 bowls of ramen, so I have 3 extra servings of noodles, which I'm going to freeze on that parchment lined baking sheet. You flash freeze them for an hour or 2 and then you can put them into a plastic bag because they've solidified into their little balls of pasta. But with the ramen that we're going to cook now, I'm going to bring a pot of water to boil, and do not salt this because these noodles are already salted. Once it's boiling, I'm going to add in a few servings of noodles at a time and boil for about 1.5 to 2 minutes. You know they're done when they violently start raising to the top and releasing that white foam. These are definitely better than store-bought, but I don't know if they're worth all that extra work, and I probably wouldn't do this very often, but it's fun to try at least once if you've never done it. Alright, lastly is all the toppings that we're going to add to this ramen, starting with the ramen eggs, which are marinated soft-boiled eggs. I'll first boil some water and carefully lower in 8 eggs and boil for exactly 7 minutes. Immediately dunk into some ice water and then you can let those cool for a second. Peel those under running water and they should stay intact. Then to marinate these, I'm going to use that Chashu liquid that I said to reserve. Just make sure you strain out all the solids. I don't quite think this is going to be salty enough on its own, so I'm going to leave a little bit of room at the top and supplement with some dark soy sauce, maybe like 1/4 to 1/2 cup. Stick a paper towel or napkin on top of these so they stay submerged and cover them and refrigerate overnight. This will leave you with a beautifully jammy and flavorful on the outside soft-boiled egg, which complements the ramen perfectly. I'm also going to prep some wood ear mushrooms, which I found these dried black mushrooms from my Asian market. Hydrate a handful of those for about 15 minutes in some water. They'll expand a bunch, and then try to take them out and chop off this rough root end that you find, and then just thinly chop these into some strips. Try to pat those dry as best as you can because we're going to sear them a bit in some oil. So over medium-high heat, I'm putting a little bit of sesame oil and dropping these mushrooms in and stirring them around. I'm adding a pinch of salt as well. They'll absorb the oil and also get some charring on the outside, which makes them tasty. Lastly, I'm just going to get a handful of scallions and chop them into some sections. Then I'll chop those sections at a full bias, which is basically fully vertically. Dunk that into some ice water and you have these really long strands of green onions which really look pretty on top of the bowl. So finally, to assemble the bowls, get everything warm if you had it in the fridge, so warm up that broth and tare. I like to warm my bowls in the microwave as well just to keep everything nice and hot. Start with your freshly boiled noodles, add in about a pint of your tonkotsu broth, then just keep adding spoonfuls of the tare until it tastes good. Like I said, at first it wasn't salty enough, so I had to add a lot of tare. Add that soft boiled egg, some of those crispy wood ear mushrooms, then a couple of slices of that beautiful Chashu pork, which if you rested it in the fridge is going to be cold, so I'm going to grab a blowtorch and just torch this up. Since they're so thin, this is all they're going to need to be brought back to life, and they'll get some char on them in the process. Add a handful of those thinly sliced curly scallions, and I like a little bit of sesame seeds in mine. I'm finishing with a couple of strips of cut up nori, and then you can marvel at your work. This is a lot of hours that you put into this if you made it from scratch. A bowl of ramen is a work of art and deserves to be admired. Take pics for Instagram and thumbnails, and then belly up. It's time to enjoy. I had my family over to eat this, but I made another bowl the next day for the taste test, so let's get to that. It's finally time, months in the making, but finally made it to the end. Obviously not something that the casual everyday cook at home is going to want to make, but if it's something you enjoy, being in the kitchen and everything, then this is a great challenge to try and give yourself. I know there's a lot of technique and history behind this specific dish, and I probably didn't nail everything, but you're still not going to go wrong with stock that you boiled for hours, with pork belly that you cooked overnight, and these homemade noodles that you sent through an expensive pasta roller. But let's go ahead and start with this tonkotsu broth. Cheers. It's not the cleanest or clearest broth like something like pho that you would eat, but there's something about the deep flavor and the pork trotters that have sat and basically melted into this. Comes out with this creamy and really mouth-coating texture that's amazing. Of course, these homemade nudes. These came out surprisingly well. I've had some issues in the past making homemade pasta, but the baking soda and I guess the resting in the fridge really made these come out nice and springy and chewy, just what you want. Like I said, this pork is probably my favorite part of this. I don't think you want to go any less than 24 hours on something so fatty like this. I can't really speak from experience, but I feel like just a few hours wouldn't render the fat out enough and it would be too chewy. But this long cook process makes it just so tender, and it literally just melts in your mouth as you eat it. And these eggs are the absolute bomb too. And this whole bowl is just a celebration of flavors and of patience, to be honest. This is not the best recipe in the world for this, but anything that you do in this realm is just going to come out amazing. But thank you if you stuck around for this much longer video with a lot more process and a lot more ingredients. Those of you that watch, do you more appreciate these long and hard recipes that I've made, or do you prefer those simpler ones that you can probably do more commonly at home? I like doing both for different reasons, so I'm just looking for some feedback. But thank you guys for watching, be blessed, and I'll see you next time. This might be your favorite part.